A locked inventory file, a sealed royal document, and one diamond name, aside from Princess Catherine's, were the starting points. For years, rumors had been circulating regarding the Queen Mother's tiara. However, the audience reportedly became silent when aides learned that Camilla's confidential claim had been denied. There was more to this than just diamonds. It had to do with inheritance, legitimacy, and the next person the monarchy trusted. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. The Queen Mother's tiara has been in that peculiar royal realm between memory and authority for years. Too symbolic to be handled like a mere jewel, too valuable to be spoken informally. It was more than just a piece of music stored in a vault. It was a piece of the emotional architecture of the old monarchy, the kind of artifact that conveyed more power in quiet than many public declarations ever could. And that's precisely why the most recent examination of the royal gem inventory created such a stir behind closed doors, according to palace sources. Notes regarding ownership, access, ceremonial use, and future custodianship were allegedly included in the file, which was purportedly treated with exceptional discretion. Initially, aides thought it would be just another quiet exercise in royal housekeeping, a standard internal evaluation. However, a single name completely changed the atmosphere in the room. Catherine, Princess. When her name was purportedly mentioned in relation to the Queen Mother's tiara, it went from being a private administrative concern to something far more explosive. Because the palace was not merely planning appearances in the future if it was associated with that treasure. It was a statement about the direction of the crown itself, inheritance, and trust. There were rumors in royal circles that certain members of Camilla's household had viewed her anticipated claim as practically inevitable. She held the title of Queen. She was standing next to Charles. She had finally attained the highest ceremonial position of her life after decades of scrutinizing. However, proximity is not always rewarded by the monarchy, which is ruthless and frigid when heritage is at risk. According to reports, senior advisors had a more critical opinion on the tiara. For them, it represented continuity, dignity, and a public trust that must not be jeopardized in the wrong hands. At that point, it was hard to overlook Catherine's quiet strength. She hadn't pushed the matter. She hadn't demanded anything. However, the decision had a strong emotional logic because of her self-control, loyalty, and developing role alongside William. Those acquainted with palace thinking claim that William unhesitatingly backed her stance. Courtiers started to comprehend the greater significance of the denied claim when they saw the tiara as a duty rather than a prize, and inside that silent support, Catherine was no longer regarded as only the Princess of Wales. She was being trained to be a legacy keeper. However, the denial of the claim was just the start, because Camilla was unable to overcome the secret history that lay behind her tiara. The tiara worn by the Queen Mother was never only a decoration kept in a velvet case. Banquets, coronations, wartime resolve, and the subdued power of a woman who saw monarchy as a means of survival were all part of its weight. It had passed through royal hands like a silent sentence for decades. Reports now indicate that Catherine, not Camilla, was the victim of the verdict. This tiara came from a world where responsibility and jewels were inextricably linked, and that was the portion that caused the palace to quake. More than anyone, the Queen Mother was aware of the harsh reality of royalty. The crown might be softened by public affection. However, discipline was what kept it intact. That lesson was contained in every diamond. Every scene seemed to be associated with a generation that understood that service, sacrifice, and quiet were necessary for survival rather than ornaments. Therefore, prominent officials weren't only wondering who had the rank to wear the tiara when it was allegedly brought up in a private inheritance debate. They wanted to know who had the moral authority to carry it. That inquiry was risky for Camilla. Her proximity, formality, and title came from her position next to King Charles, yet palace memory endures longer than public declarations. There were rumors that certain courtesans were worried that if the music went straight into her hands, the tiara might draw the incorrect contrast. Not because the jewel was unattractive, but rather because it was judgmental. Endurance, wartime dignity, and a keen sense of public sentiment were the cornerstones of the Queen Mother's legacy. Instead of appearing as a difficulty within that heritage, any future custodian would have to appear as an extension of it. At that point, Catherine's name started to acquire new significance. She was not being portrayed as someone who was ravenous for royal riches. Quietly, she was being perceived more and more as the one who could provide the ancient monarchy a sense of security in the contemporary era. Catherine's self-control had become an asset. Her argument had become her patience. Her silence had turned into a sort of evidence. According to reports, the emotional logic was apparent even to those who refrained from choosing sides. Catherine stood for a future the public could trust, continuity without debate, and dignity without coercion. Above all, the decision appeared to be sealed by the influence of the late Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth did not see heirlooms as personal gifts, as anyone familiar with the old royal order knew. They were trusting musical instruments. They only relocated when the organization required it. Furthermore, the court was doing more than just awarding a princess if the Queen Mother's tiara was now being directed toward Catherine. One diamond at a time, it was safeguarding a sacred line of meaning. Camilla's journey toward the tiara started to fall apart when it was viewed as an inheritance rather than a luxury. Palace rumors claim that Camilla thought the dispute was straightforward. Years spent next to the king, rank, and closeness ought to have been important. However, the music of royalty has always been colder than emotion. The possession of the past is not assured by a position next to the crown. Additionally, there was no bargaining when her claim allegedly ended up on the wrong desk. It was a rejection. If the rumors are accurate, that rejection did not come with public humiliation or shouted voices, because it leaves no clear enemy to face. It arrives in the icy language of royal protocol, the kind that hurts more deeply. Seniority was the key to Camilla's case. According to people familiar with the home environment, she ruled as queen. Through years of criticism, quiet, and uneasy acceptance, she had stood by Charles. It's possible that people in her social circle assumed the Queen Mother's tiara would be easily accessible to her as part of the ceremonial realm she now inhabited, rather than as a favor. However, within the palace, title was not the only criterion used to evaluate the dispute. Senior advisors apparently started posing a riskier query. Would Camilla's tiara strengthen the crown or rekindle the wounds the monarchy had spent decades trying to heal? That was the cruel computation. Not sentiment, not retaliation. Computation. A private gem decision may become a national discussion about legitimacy, history, and the unsolved shadows of the past if the Queen Mother's tiara was misused. In contrast, Catherine's name appeared to alter the tone of the entire discussion. Without having to make an announcement, she stood for the future. Her popularity was viewed as protection for the institution itself rather than just as approval ratings. According to reports, courtiers contrasted the complex public narrative around Camilla with the symbolic weight of Catherine's reserve, and the contrast became unavoidable. Catherine looked like continuity. Camilla was still controversial to certain old guards. Furthermore, the palace was reluctant to accept the chance of controversy since the tiara was seen as a symbol of royal memory. The fact that everything happened so silently was awful. There was no need for a spectacular showdown. There was no explanation provided to the public. With frigid precision, the decision was made through private channels, and Camilla's supporters gradually realized that the case was no longer appealable. The claim had not been saved by her rank. The verdict had not been altered by her closeness to the king. The deeper anxiety in the palace had not been dispelled by years spent with Charles. That some jewels are more than just ornaments. They reveal it. The most agonizing aspect was not that Camilla lost the claim, but rather who was prepared to accept what she thought was rightfully hers. Catherine didn't ask for the tiara. According to sources, this is the exact reason the decision gained such influence. She didn't bargain, push, or run for office. It was duty, not ambition, that brought her name into the conversation, and that subtle restraint turned into the very trait that made her unmissable in a kingdom where every move is calculated. Catherine's silence started to speak louder than any argument once Camilla's claim allegedly hit the palace wall. She may have recognized the significance of the Queen Mother's tiara, according to those acquainted with the private mood. However, she was also aware of the risk of coming across as eager. Wanting too much might be a flaw in the life of a king. Asking too bluntly can transform respectability into hunger. Catherine didn't either. She remained calm, circumspect, and cautious, letting the institution determine whether or not she was deserving of bearing what others had attempted to claim. Palace rumors claim that became the pivotal moment because of that constraint. Senior advisors allegedly started portraying Catherine as a caretaker rather than a beneficiary. That distinction was important. A recipient gets something. Custodians provide protection. Furthermore, it became nearly difficult to ignore Catherine's name when the tiara was brought up in relation to upcoming state events, royal continuity, and the monarchy's image following Charles. She had already come to represent stability in the public's perception. The palace now seemed prepared to make that impression official. The final strength of the decision is said to have come from William's support. It was stated that he saw the tiara as a component of the hefty construction of his wife's future rather than as a brilliant gift. Catherine would not just stand at his side. She would assist in bearing the crown's emotional burden. In this way, the Queen Mother's tiara evolved from a jewel to something much more significant. It turned into preparedness. It turned into a tacit approval. It turned into a warning that, behind closed doors, the new monarchy was already taking shape. Then the red box appeared, or at least it was spoken in hushed tones. The red box represents formality, order, and judgments that go beyond gossip and into the realm of consequence in royal lingo. According to reports, things dramatically shifted after Catherine's participation was discussed through those official channels. According to reports, staff started creating private gem protocols for her upcoming appearances, and that in and of itself sent a message across the home. The use of Catherine in the narrative was not coincidental. She was positioned as the emotional pillar of the monarchy, the person who could carry on the legacy without appearing to have taken it. And the old question came back with a vengeful intensity as Catherine's stance grew stronger. What was Queen Elizabeth's real desire? Queen Elizabeth's power continues to flow through the palace hallways like a sealed order even after her passing. According to reports, Tiara's decision was largely influenced by her preferences, notes, and personal understanding. She had witnessed the monarchy endure scandal, divorce, loss, and rebirth. Furthermore, Camilla's defeat might have been written long before the accusation was even made if her judgment was still significant. The Queen Mother's tiara issue felt more significant than a private family argument because of this. Who was currently closest to King Charles was not just a matter of, it was a matter of who the monarch with the longest tenure had previously trusted. As the conversation progressed, palace insiders claim that long-preserved household memos, private understandings, and older dual orders were discreetly examined, and the same unseen pressure appeared to reappear with each old document that was allegedly brought back into view. Elizabeth's survival instinct, responsibility, and self-control. No one knew more than Queen Elizabeth that royal heirlooms could not be regarded as sentimental belongings. In addition to honoring a single woman, a tiara might safeguard an entire organization. That was the old royal order's ruthless wisdom. Jewels moved with caution. They made meaningful movements. Only when the palace needed to convey a message without using words did they move. The message was devastatingly obvious if the Queen Mother's tiara was being directed toward Catherine rather than Camilla. Rank was not the only factor in the old monarchy's rewards. It involved deciding on discipline. This resulted in a strong and nearly intolerable strain on Catherine. She was being positioned as the logical continuation of a royal code that Elizabeth had devoted her life to upholding, rather than as a rival who had defeated Camilla. Catherine appeared to be in line with the ideals that molded the late Queen and the Queen Mother before her because of her self-control, her cautious allegiance, and her peaceful acceptance of duty. In this way, the tiara started to resemble a test rather than an inheritance. could transport the past without making it into a spectacle? Could she preserve legacy without seeming to want it? Whispers claims that Camilla's claim battled something much more challenging than paperwork. It battled unresolved historical issues. It battled memory. It battled the palace's concern that certain emblems are too brittle to be used in areas where public opinion is still divided. According to reports, courtiers interpreted the result with icy simplicity. The past had selected the future, and duty had triumphed over individual entitlement. However, the decision could not be stuck in archaic documents and personal interpretations indefinitely, which led to a new issue. The live monarch still had to deal with the political maelstrom, even if the late Queen's shadow resolved the moral dispute. According to reports, King Charles turned the tiara issue into a personal tragedy shrouded in constitutional quiet. His wife, hurt by rejection, stood to one side. The organization he had spent his entire life getting ready to inherit was on the opposite side. There was more to the choice than just appeasing a household. The goal was to prevent another fracture of the crown at the most critical time. Charles was unable to break free from the responsibility. When a royal family member's private disappointment reaches the crown, it becomes more weighty. And there was a horrible weight to this one. Camilla's followers saw her rejection as more than just a personal hurt. According to reports, it felt like a public future was being subtly curtailed behind royal walls. Many believed that the old symbols would eventually come together around her after she had stood by Charles for years, endured criticism, and waited for approval. However, sympathy did not cause the Queen Mother's tiara to move. It moved in accordance with heritage. According to reports, Charles recognized the emotional harm right away. He was aware of the consequences of rejection within his own family. He was aware that Camilla would perceive it not only as a misplaced gem, but also as a frightening indication that certain areas of the palace continued to reject her complete symbolic approval. However, palace rumors state that advisors advised him not to get involved. They cautioned that the monarchy might appear careless, emotional, and oblivious to popular mood if the recommendation was overturned. The tiara had already grown too risky to handle carelessly, too apparent in private circles, and too charged. William came next. Charles found himself in an even more precarious situation due to his alleged support for Catherine. This was not a small domestic dispute. It was a conflict between stability in the future and loyalty in the now. Catherine was viewed by William as the next emotional pillar of the kingdom. Charles also had to think about the cost of any reversal once that argument took shape. He ran the risk of undermining Catherine's ascent if he saved Camilla's claim. He exposed his wife to a shame that no title could lessen if he let the rejection stand. That was the moment's tragedy. Insiders had depicted Charles as tense and worn out from the demands on him, so he had to decide that silence was the least harmful tactic. He refrained from publicly criticizing Camilla. Although he did not openly put Catherine above her, in a monarchy, rejection can be shown non-verbally. Charles essentially let the palace determine what he could not bear to speak out loud by keeping the recommendation unaltered. The crown could not bend just because the wound was personal. Stability was more important than personal comfort, and the palace machinery moved with frigid precision once Charles declined to save the claim. There was no feeling in the subsequent stage. It had to do with administration. It became even colder as a result. According to reports, private vault instructions were examined, dual access lists were modified, and ceremonial planning was subtly revised to accommodate Catherine's future visits. Camilla knew what had happened without the necessity for a public statement. A name removal can be more powerful than a shouted insult in palace lingo. The conflict reached its harshest stage after Charles permitted the denial to stand. The phase of files, not the phase of emotions. According to reports, the palace system started to move with the same silent might that has always been so destructive to royal bureaucracy. A discussion turns into a note. A message turns into a directive. A protocol is created from an instruction. Even the most influential members of the royal household may find themselves standing outside a door that no longer opens for them once that process starts. According to reports, a new level of confidential handling was applied to the Queen Mother's tiara, which workers started to understand as the Queen Mother Tiara Protocol. There was no explanation, no announcement, and no dressed-up punishment. It was so harsh because of that. While Camilla's household experienced nothing but stillness, the jewel's future was being reconfigured around Catherine. No apologies, no speech, and no dramatic altercation. Just the gradual realization that future appearances were being planned with Catherine at the center. Access language had changed, and ceremonial planning had altered. This was not a triumphant moment, in the conventional sense for Catherine. It weighed more than that. She was getting closer to a part she couldn't easily turn down with each change made to her name. The palace was no longer only guarding a tiara. It was getting ready for a public symbol. According to reports, advisors knew that the significance would become clear when Catherine finally seemed linked to the Queen Mother's legacy. It would convey to the nation that the future queen was being trusted with the sentimental treasures of the past, and that the old monarchy had found its custodian. Because was imperceptible to the outer world, Camilla's allies felt more humiliated. They were unable to object to something that had not been formally announced. A decision that had been wrapped in procedure could not be contested. However, the message was apparently obvious within the household. The future queen had eschewed the current consort. The assertion had not just fallen short. It had been incorporated into a new royal hierarchy in which Camilla's status was less important than Catherine's constraint. The balance of power changed once again during that quiet. However, the vault did not conceal the true shock. It was waiting for Catherine to be recognized as the designated guardian for the first time. The message was unmistakable by the time the final choice was made. It was not only a tiara that Catherine had inherited. She had inherited a warning, a blessing, and a burden. Camilla's denied claim remained a silent wound within the present, but the Queen Mother's gems now pointed toward the future. Once more, the monarchy prioritized tradition over sentiment. That was the real significance of the situation. For Catherine, this was not a win to be noisily celebrated, not a brilliant trophy to possess over others, and not a selfish victory derived from Camilla's loss. It was much more difficult. The tiara was accompanied by history and the memories of women who realized that monarchy can only last when duty takes precedence over desire. Expectations were woven into each stone. Not only was Catherine trusted to wear that legacy, but she was also trusted to safeguard it. According to reports, the decision was seen as a turning point in royal circles. The Queen Mother's tiara had come to represent royal perseverance, family continuity, and popular trust. It served as a reminder to everyone that the crown is not influenced by emotional pressure, personal claims, or personal hurt. It moves in accordance with the institution's safeguards. And because the palace seemed to view Catherine and William as the safest hands for the monarchy's next chapter, they emerged stronger than before in that cold calculation, not because they had demanded authority. According to reports, Camilla's rejection left a need that no title could adequately fill. Beside Charles, she continued to be queen. However, there was a different kind of humiliation associated with this specific decision. It implied that some symbols still belonged to a more profound royal memory that rank alone could not access. It wasn't only that her claim had failed. When the future of the crown is at risk, it has become a part of a bigger palace tale about perception, trust, and the boundaries of power. The result was rendered much more acute by Charles's silence. He affirmed what the royal apparatus had already shown by declining to overturn the ruling. The suggestion would remain in effect. Catherine would continue to be associated with the legacy of the Queen Mother. The monarchy would carry on, wrapped in the same cruel lesson it has always taught its own family, while Camilla would have to deal with the pain in solitude. Duty, not personal claim, owns the crown. As a result, the tiara evolved beyond diamonds. It served as a cautionary tale for anyone who thought that feelings alone could influence royal inheritance. It turned out to be a blessing for Catherine, a burden for William's future rule, and a warning that legacy makes deliberate, silent, and occasionally brutal decisions. One truth continued to shimmer in the quiet as the vault door shut behind the Queen Mother's tiara. Gems are never just jewels in the House of Windsor. They are judgments. I appreciate you watching. We'll see you in the next one, so please remember to like and subscribe.